In the palatial corridors of Renaissance Florence, few names carried the weight of the Medici. Yet, in the early 15th century, behind the gilded facade of Florence's most powerful family, a boy was being groomed not for greatness, but for survival. Piero di Cosimo de Medici, born in 1416, was the eldest son of Cosimo de Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence and architect of the Medici banking empire. But where Cosimo was physically resilient and politically cautious, Piero was something altogether different, intellectually sharp, but physically frail, chronically ill, and plagued from youth by the ravages of gout, a hereditary affliction that would shape both his body and his reign. From his earliest days, Piero was a creature of confinement, afflicted with the same painful inflammation that had tormented his grandfather Giovanni de Medici. Piero's days were punctuated by swollen joints, immobilizing pain, and prolonged convalescence. Unlike other Medici scions who were sent across Europe to build alliances or manage branches of the family bank, Piero remained rooted in Florence. His education was elite, guided by humanist scholars and steeped in classical philosophy, but his experience of the world was mediated through documents, letters, and the reports of others. By adolescence, Piero had already acquired a reputation for cautiousness, bordering on paranoia traits often misread by contemporaries as signs of timidity or indecisiveness. Cosimo de Medici, known in his later years as Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, was deeply aware of the unstable foundation on which Medici power rested. The family had no formal titles, no royal lineage, and ruled Florence largely through patronage banking influence and a carefully curated network of allies among the city's elites. Cosimo's own grip on power had been tested during his exile in 1433, an event that left him wary of factionalism and betrayal. It was perhaps this memory that led Cosimo to keep Piero close, involving him in family affairs, but shielding him from direct exposure to Florence's cutthroat politics. As the 1450s progressed, Cosimo's health began to decline, and he increasingly relied on Piero to manage aspects of the Medici bank. Despite his ill health, Piero proved an able financier. He took meticulous notes, maintained rigid records, and cautiously curtailed risky lending practices that had caused losses in northern European branches. Yet within the inner sanctum of the Medici palace, tensions brewed. Cosimo's younger son Giovanni was favored by several family advisors, while external allies such as the powerful Albizzi and Pitti families openly questioned whether the ailing Piero could ever fill his father's formidable shoes. This skepticism was not merely political. Piero's physical condition left him dependent on a staff of attendants to help him move between rooms. On particularly bad days, he conducted affairs of state from his bed, propped up by cushions and swaddled in layers of linen. Medical remedies of the day, ground herbs, leaching wine-soaked poultices, did little to curb the advance of his disease. Privately, he began to order crates of opium and powdered coral to dull the pain, consumed not for recreation but as a daily necessity. These measures remained hidden from public view, but whispers among servants and physicians began to circulate. How long, they wondered, could such a man endure the weight of Florence? Despite his vulnerability, Piero was observant. He understood the nature of perception in a republic that prided itself on civic virtue and balance. Florence, though governed by elites, still held up the myth of republicanism, that no single man ruled, but that the city was guided by the will of its citizens. Cosimo had skillfully manipulated this illusion, exercising power indirectly through allies in the signoria of the city's ruling council. Piero, by contrast, lacked his father's social subtlety. Where Cosimo preferred quiet influence, Piero was more direct, more anxious, and less patient with ambiguity. One formative experience deeply etched itself into Piero's political psyche, the silent fallout from the death of his uncle Lorenzo, who had helped stabilize the Medici's grip on Florence through both diplomacy and threat. In the void Lorenzo left behind, Piero witnessed how quickly allies could become predators. Once cordial families began reaching for lucrative banking contracts, attempting to influence civic appointments and courting the favor of rival factions. Piero's notes from this period show an obsessive interest in court records, merchant disputes, and the fluctuating alliances within the gonfaloniere circles, Florence's rotating system of civic leadership. He was not just preparing to inherit power. He was bracing for an ambush. In private, Cosimo began to waver. Though Piero was the designated heir, doubts about his capacity persisted. Some in the family circle suggested bypassing Piero entirely in favor of his more charismatic son, the young Lorenzo. Cosimo dismissed the idea, but the fact that it was spoken aloud reveals how tenuous Piero's position had become. The patriarch's decision to name Piero as successor in 1461 was accompanied by an urgent tightening of inner circle loyalty. Cosimo instructed key bankers, merchants, and members of the clergy to remain aligned with the Medici cause after his death, and to support my son who has wisdom, though not always the strength. When Cosimo died in 1464, the transition of power was swift but uneasy. Piero became the head of both the Medici Bank and the informal ruler of Florence. The outward ceremony was dignified public mourning, civic pronouncements, and a seamless procession from father to son. But behind closed doors, it was a precarious inheritance. Piero's gout flared with particular violence during the funeral rites, requiring him to be carried on a litter, even in private. Rumors began to spread that he had been poisoned by rivals, eager to prevent his succession, a baseless claim, but one that underscored how deeply Florence mistrusted its new leader. Within weeks of assuming power, Piero began purging city offices of unreliable figures and moving family records to more secure locations. He installed new locks on the Medici Palazzo's treasury and issued instructions for secret inventories of silver ledgers and correspondence. Servants were dismissed with no explanation. Former allies were demoted or sent to distant posts. Piero was not yet at war, but he was already preparing for siege. In this atmosphere of quiet dread, the tone of his rule was set. Piero the Gouty, as he would come to be known, had stepped into his father's role not as a statesman, but as a patient. And Florence, the city of light and learning, would now be governed by a man whose mind remained sharp while his body slowly betrayed him. The death of Cosimo de Medici in August 1464 marked more than a dynastic handoff. It signaled a change in Florence's political chemistry. Cosimo had ruled from the shadows with the finesse of a veteran banker, never overtly seizing power yet controlling appointments, managing debts and orchestrating marriages to cement loyalty. His son Piero inherited not only his position, but a delicate network of obligations that required constant calibration. Unlike Cosimo, Piero lacked both the physical vigor and the political camouflage that had allowed his father to operate with impunity. His rise was official, not inferred. His presence was not subtle, but centralized. And this shift unsettled Florence. The initial months of Piero's rule were calm on the surface, but the Medici's enemies began to stir. Among them was Luca Pitti, a man whose name had once been spoken in admiration within the Medici household. Pitti had been a staunch ally of Cosimo and had risen through the ranks with Medici backing. He held vast wealth, had connections to mercantile circles, and was closely associated with the construction of the massive Palazzo Pitti, intended to rival the Medici's own palatial residence. But power had bred ambition. With Cosimo gone and Piero viewed as weakened by illness, Pitti began to recalculate his loyalties. Other factions watched closely. The Albizzi, though politically marginalized since Cosimo's return from exile in 1434, retained deep familial networks and influence in certain Florentine guilds. The Soderini Neroni and Acciaiuoli families, all long wary of Medici dominance, began meeting more frequently, often under the guise of religious or mercantile gatherings. These families did not openly conspire at first, but their conversations took on a darker tone. They were no longer just critics. They were waiting for the right opportunity. Inside the Medici circle, the pressure on Piero was mounting. His health was deteriorating. The chronic gout attacks left him bedridden for days. Physicians administered wine and poultices of mashed poppy seed and belladonna, which dulled his pain but left his senses clouded. At times he conducted affairs of state while trembling from fever, his skin sallow and his body wrapped in woolen blankets. Rumors circulated among Florentine servants that he had begun hallucinating during episodes of pain, once reportedly accusing a bronze bust of Cosimo in his study of speaking ill of him during the night. Whether apocryphal or not, the story reflected an emerging perception that the city was now ruled by a man whose mind teetered on the edge of delusion. Despite this, Piero took decisive, if blunt, steps to solidify his rule. He demanded personal control over the accounts of the Medici Bank, an unusual move that alienated long-trusted managers. He commissioned a complete review of all outstanding debts owed to the Medici family, ordering that certain accounts, especially those of politically hostile families, be called in prematurely. This tactic, while financially sound in theory, quickly became a political cudgel. Bankruptcies followed. Merchants who had once spoken fondly of Medici generosity now viewed Piero's office as predatory. But the most consequential step Piero took in the early years of his rule was the reshaping of the Florentine Signoria. The city's executive council, nominally a republican body, was subject to selection by lot. In practice, however, it had long been influenced by patronage. Cosimo had used bribery and subtle threats to ensure that names favorable to the Medici found their way into the electoral purse. Piero was less subtle. He relied on intimidation and closed-door pressure to remove adversaries from eligibility. In one particularly disturbing episode, 2 members of the Gonfaloniere were found disqualified after anonymous accusations of moral impropriety were lodged, allegations believed to have been fabricated by Medici loyalists. By 1465, Florence was uneasy. The Medici grip remained firm, but cracks had begun to show. Political dinners turned into covert planning sessions. Monastic orders, particularly the Dominicans at San Marco, began to speak more openly about civic corruption, using veiled sermons that condemned those who sit in gold while the people bleed copper. Though never named directly, the implication was clear. Florence was governed by wealth, not virtue. Then came a peculiar event, obscure but psychologically revealing. In early 1466, a disgraced scribe named Alessandro Rinuccini was arrested for forging signatures on minor tax documents. But what interested the Signoria was not the fraud, but a journal found among his possessions. Inside were grotesque sketches of Piero's face drawn bloated and disfigured, accompanied by satirical verses accusing him of poisoning his father and selling Florentine honor to foreign bankers. Most chillingly, the manuscript included a full page devoted to remedies for royal disease, listing ingredients such as crushed pearl lizard's tongue and powdered bone items, sometimes used in occult practices. The implication that someone within Florence viewed Piero not only as illegitimate, but as supernaturally tainted disturbed even his allies. Rinuccini was tortured and exiled. The manuscript was destroyed. But the incident underscored the growing perception of Piero as not just physically frail, but morally corrupted. In the months that followed, Piero's paranoia hardened into policy. He tightened surveillance of city notaries, introduced a new system of coded correspondence among Medici agents, and began keeping nightly records of suspected enemies. These Piero lists, as they were known among his inner circle, included names, guild affiliations, recent travel, and suspected associations. It marked a shift from Cosimo's strategy of inclusion and compromise to Piero's style of preemption and suspicion. Still, the heir was not entirely isolated. His wife Lucrezia Tornabuoni remained a stabilizing presence. Intelligent and politically astute, she handled correspondence, advised on appointments, and served as a quiet intermediary between Piero and the city's intellectual elite. She understood better than most that Piero's visible weakness necessitated invisible strength. But even Lucrezia could not prevent the growing danger. In mid-1466, reports reached Piero's household that several powerful Florentine families had begun negotiating with external actors, most notably Francesco Sforza of Milan and King Ferrante of Naples. These were not idle threats. An alliance between discontented Florentine oligarchs and hostile powers could spell the end of Medici dominance. The question was no longer if an attempt would be made to unseat Piero, but when and how violently. By the close of 1466, Florence simmered. Behind its painted facades and public celebrations, it had become a city of whispers and watchers. Piero, alone in his richly appointed bedchamber, wrapped his swollen limbs in velvet-lined bindings and read by candlelight. His father's ledgers lay open before him, alongside reports from informants and doctors' notes about his declining condition. The burden of legacy pressed down like an iron weight. The city had not rejected him yet, but his unnatural succession had not gone uncontested, and the hour of confrontation approached. The spring of 1466 brought little warmth to Florence. Beneath the tiled rooftops and frescoed chapels, the city was being stalked by something colder than seasonal wind's uncertainty. The Medici regime had become brittle, no longer sustained by consensus, but by the daily calculations of loyalty, convenience, and fear. And Piero de Medici, though nominally the most powerful man in Florence, spent much of his time confined to a bedchamber, lined with medicinal jars, surrounded by physicians, scribes, and trusted retainers, who were themselves beginning to fracture in allegiance. The names of his enemies were not drawn from the rabble but from Florence's most distinguished families. Chief among them were the Pitti the Soderini, the Niccolini, and the Baroncelli houses that had either once supported the Medici or tolerated them out of political necessity. With Cosimo's unifying presence gone and Piero's personal frailty on full display, these families began to see opportunity. Luca Pitti, once the most conspicuous beneficiary of Medici patronage, had grown increasingly emboldened. His grand architectural project, the Palazzo Pitti, loomed like a statement of independence, casting a literal and symbolic shadow over the Medici's own seat of power. Piero had suspected betrayal from Pitti for some time. His letters to confidants betray a gnawing anxiety with phrases like the fox who now wears a lion's hide, and his loyalties are a game of dice. Yet he hesitated to act, perhaps because of long-standing ties, or perhaps because his deteriorating condition left him unable to engage directly with the political rituals required to isolate and neutralize a nobleman of Pitti's stature. Whatever the reason, Piero delayed an error that nearly cost him his regime. By July 1466, a formal conspiracy had coalesced. Led by Luca Pitti, the plotters included Diedasalvi Neroni and Agnolo Acciaiuoli, both former allies of the Medici. Their plan was swift and brutal to assassinate Piero during one of his regular carriage rides outside the city seized control of the Signoria and force a reorganization of the Florentine constitution that would eliminate Medici influence once and for all. It was to be a civic correction, not a revolution, a surgical removal of a corrupt and illegitimate node in Florence's republican body. The plan very nearly succeeded. On August 2, 1466, Piero prepared to travel to his villa in Careggi, a relatively routine journey made for health and solitude. Unbeknownst to him, assassins had been posted along the Via Bolognese. The attackers had coordinated with soldiers stationed just outside the city, prepared to enforce the coup once news of the assassination reached the Piazza della Signoria. But fortune, fueled perhaps by Piero's perpetual anxiety, intervened. The night before the trip, one of his sons fell ill, prompting Piero to postpone departure by a day. When the assassins realized they had been misinformed, they dispersed. The plot had failed by a margin of hours. Yet the danger was not gone. In the aftermath of the failed ambush, Piero did not wait. He ordered the immediate arrest of several known conspirators, including Neroni and Acciaiuoli. Others fled Florence before they could be seized. Luca Pitti, ever calculating, publicly denounced the plot, claimed ignorance, and swore loyalty to the Medici, while quietly sheltering other conspirators in his palace. Piero could not move against him without provoking civil war. To legitimize his crackdown, Piero produced a letter allegedly intercepted by Medici informants detailing parts of the conspiracy. Modern historians debate its authenticity. Whether forged or genuine, it served its purpose, public justification for what followed. Trials were held, sentences passed. Several lesser conspirators were tortured, their confessions extracted beneath the red-hot tongs of Florentine inquisitors. At least 2 were hanged in the public square, their bodies left on display for 3 days, a grim warning in the heart of the Republic. One disturbing detail emerged from these interrogations, often omitted from the more polished Florentine chronicles. A servant confessed that he had been instructed to pierce Piero's feet with thin blades, during the attack ensuring that his illness would be complete in death as it was in life. Whether metaphor or malice, the image of targeting Piero's most afflicted joints as part of the assassination struck observers as macabre. It reflected how fully his identity had become entwined with his disease. He was no longer just Piero de Medici, but Piero the Gouty, a man defined by his infirmity. After the conspiracy's collapse, Florence entered a period of sharp political polarization. Piero took this as both vindication and mandate. He expanded the reach of his informant network and doubled the presence of armed guards near the Medici palace. New laws were enacted allowing expedited trials for those accused of conspiracy, bypassing traditional legal norms. In the public eye, the Republic began to resemble a family-run state, technically free but functionally controlled. This shift caused discomfort even among some of Piero's allies. One banker, in a private letter to a Milanese colleague, wrote, "We are all citizens, but we live in one man's hospital." The metaphor was apt. Florence had become a city forced to accommodate the limitations and compulsions of a sickly ruler. Civic rituals were reorganized to minimize Piero's exposure to heat and strain. Audiences with foreign diplomats took place in perfumed chambers where the scent of decaying flesh, likely the result of ulcerated gout wounds, was masked with incense and rose oil. His bed became a sort of throne, and politics were conducted around it. Yet even from this compromised position, Piero remained dangerous. He wielded money like a weapon, orchestrating the financial ruin of exiled families by blocking credit lines and seizing collateral properties. More than once he arranged for local artisans and goldsmiths to receive emergency loans only to demand public declarations of gratitude, a subtle but clear signal to the populace about who controlled the city's purse strings. His enemies, meanwhile, scattered across the peninsula. Neroni fled to Rome and later found sanctuary in Milan. Agnolo Acciaiuoli was exiled and stripped of his titles. But Luca Pitti remained in Florence too powerful to confront directly. The palace he had built, once envisioned as a symbol of rising republicanism, now sat half-finished, a monument to ambitions thwarted. It was in these post-conspiracy months that Piero began to cultivate his son Lorenzo more seriously. Though only in his late teens, Lorenzo was groomed not merely as heir to the Medici name, but as a stabilizing force for a city on edge. Piero increasingly delegated tasks to him, allowing Lorenzo to meet with ambassadors, arbitrate minor disputes, and participate in ceremonial functions. Observers noted the contrast immediately, where Piero was reclusive and brittle. Lorenzo was energetic, sociable, and composed. Whispers began that Florence would not have to wait long for a more fitting prince. Still, Piero held on. He refused to resign, abdicate, or disappear. Despite his afflictions, he remained mentally sharp, his memory keen and his instinct for betrayal sharper than ever. He knew that the plot against him had been just the beginning. And if Florence had once been a city ruled by trust and patronage, it had now become something colder, more calculating, less a republic, and more an armory dressed in velvet. Florence, in the aftermath of the 1466 conspiracy, was a city cloaked in civility but laced with tension. The mechanisms of daily governance, guild meetings, trade regulations, religious festivals proceeded with ritualistic order. Yet the shadow of the attempted coup against Piero de Medici lingered over every political gesture. Trust had decayed, and with it the delicate fabric of Florentine republicanism. Piero, having survived an assassination attempt and exposed a sprawling conspiracy, responded not with reconciliation but with containment. Power, he concluded, could no longer be shared. It had to be fortified. The Medici Palace transformed from a center of patronage into a fortified command post. While still hosting banquets and cultural salons, its back halls were now manned by armed guards and dotted with hidden chambers for documents and valuables. In his weakened condition, Piero rarely appeared in public without a protective entourage. These precautions extended even to his family. His sons were assigned personal attendants, and all movement beyond city walls was accompanied by hand-picked escorts. For Piero, the lesson of 1466 was clear. Florence was not to be trusted. Privately, he began referring to the Medici residence as Il Palagio, a subtle shift in tone from Palazzo. Palagio carried connotations of courtliness and princely authority, while Palazzo remained associated with the civic life of the Republic. The linguistic slippage reflected a deeper transformation. Florence, under Piero's stewardship, was slowly reorienting itself from communal governance toward dynastic rule. What Cosimo had done indirectly, Piero was now enacting more overtly. To manage his increasingly centralized authority, Piero relied on a shrinking circle of confidants. Among them was Diodasalvi Neroni's former associate, Jacopo de Poggio, who had defected after the failed coup and offered his services to the Medici. Jacopo was rewarded with control over correspondence and internal security, effectively becoming Piero's spy master. Under his supervision, Florence's surveillance apparatus expanded. Informants were embedded in merchant guilds, monastic orders, and even artisan workshops. Citizens became cautious with their words, aware that an idle complaint might be recorded and relayed to the Palagio. This tightening grip had its most chilling manifestation in the network of camere secrete secret rooms beneath the Medici Palace. Originally constructed for secure document storage, the chambers were now repurposed as holding cells for political detainees. Most prisoners were not formally charged. Some were subjected to interrogations designed less for confessions and more for humiliation, forced to recount their political associations while kneeling deprived of sleep and threatened with mutilation. One account from a dismissed palace scribe described prisoners being shown forged letters implicating their friends in imagined plots, then told they could secure release only by naming co-conspirators. Though executions were rare, Florentine sensibilities still balked at public bloodshed. Exile became a common punishment. Between 1466 and 1469, dozens of citizens were forcibly relocated to remote corners of Tuscany, stripped of wealth and barred from returning under penalty of imprisonment. This legal gray zone, neither formal prosecution nor mob violence, allowed Piero to eliminate dissent without martyring his enemies. It also created an atmosphere of unspoken dread. Florentines who had once debated politics in public squares now turned to whispered remarks behind closed doors. One especially unnerving practice emerged during this period, l'anello chiuso, or the closed ring. Citizens summoned to appear before the signoria would enter a chamber where a circle of chairs was arranged around a central seat. The accused would sit under the scrutiny of silent officials, sometimes for hours, as notes were passed and glances exchanged. No accusations were read aloud and no defense was permitted. Those who left the ring were either reinstated quietly or never seen in the city again. The ritual had no legal status, but it gained notoriety as a symbol of Piero's opaque and psychological approach to justice. Meanwhile, Piero's physical decline continued. The gout, once episodic, had become near constant. His feet and hands were swollen, discolored, and sometimes oozed from ulcerations. He developed fevers that left him delirious, during which he muttered financial figures or barked orders to invisible aides. His physicians rotated treatments with little success. Purges, with antimony wine mixed with mercury-crushed emerald administered in honey. At one point, desperate for relief, he allowed a wandering mystic who claimed to have cured noblemen in Naples to apply a poultice made from lamb fat and clay over his inflamed joints. It offered no benefit. The mystic was quietly dismissed and later found dead, drowned in the Arno. Officially, it was ruled a suicide. Despite his condition, Piero maintained an iron grip on the mechanisms of state. When his advisors suggested he delegate more authority to his son Lorenzo, he agreed, but only partially. Lorenzo was permitted to host foreign envoys and oversee festivals, but critical matters, loans, exile orders, and appointments to the signoria remained under Piero's direct control. He trusted no one completely. Even Lucrezia Tornabuoni, whose counsel he once relied on, was sidelined in matters concerning internal security. What disturbed many Florentines was not merely the centralization of power, but the clinical, impersonal nature of Piero's rule. There were no fiery speeches, no populist appeals. Instead, there were ledgers, letters lists. He governed with the demeanor of a banker tracking liabilities. In a city that prized rhetorical brilliance and civic participation, this reduction of politics to arithmetic felt both alien and unsettling. Still, not all was repression. Piero continued the Medici tradition of patronage, commissioning altarpieces and funding libraries. He supported Marsilio Ficino's translations of Plato and maintained correspondence with scholars across Italy. But these gestures, once viewed as marks of enlightened rule, now seemed more like ceremonial offerings, attempts to mask a regime increasingly defined by fear. The juxtaposition was stark. The Medici palace displayed Botticelli sketches while torture was carried out below its floors. By 1468, Florence was quiet, but it was the quiet of exhaustion, not peace. The city had grown used to the peculiar rhythms of Piero's rule edicts issued from his bedchamber nobles exiled without trial, debts called in or forgiven on political whim. It had also learned to live with the ever-present scent of camphor and vinegar that followed Piero wherever he was carried, used to cleanse his decaying limbs and mask the odors of chronic infection. One visitor to Florence during this period, a Venetian merchant, noted in his journal, "He rules like a ghost, present in name, but drifting through corridors others fear to enter." It was a fitting image. Piero's governance had become spectral, its influence total, but its form indistinct. Like a sickness that seeps into every organ of the body politic, it left the city functional but deeply compromised. And yet the machinery held. The Medici bank, though diminished, remained solvent. The streets remained safe. Trade resumed. Florence had not collapsed, but its spirit, its republican vitality, had withered under the weight of suspicion, surveillance, and silent repression. The next stage of Piero's reign would not be marked by new conspiracies or bold campaigns. It would be marked by decay, not of the state, but of the man. His body was failing. His mind, once vigilant, was clouding. And for all his efforts to tighten control, there were things even he could no longer hold in his grasp. By the start of 1469, Florence was ruled less by a man than by the rituals he left behind. Piero de Medici, now in his early 50s, was almost entirely confined to bed. His joints had become stiff masses of calcified tissue, his mobility reduced to brief transfers between cushions or into a wheeled litter. His limbs bore the discolored marks of repeated bloodletting, and failed treatment leaves of abscessed tissue clung to his ankles, and the smell of decay despite perfumed linens had become a constant presence in his chambers. He could no longer grip a quill for long. Most of his notes were dictated in a rasping voice and transcribed by scribes trained to ignore the slurred diction and occasional groans that punctuated his speech. Yet governance did not stop. In fact, it intensified. Confined to his chambers, Piero began to reassert control through paper proxy and fear. Unable to walk the streets of Florence, he projected his will through a stream of decrees, financial orders, and coded memoranda, always sealed with his personal cipher and signed with the distinctive looping P he had practiced since youth. He became obsessed with correspondence, issuing dozens of letters each day, tracking merchant behavior guild votes, and even monastery appointments. All of Florence, it seemed, filtered back to the bedside of a man who could no longer stand. This transformation in rule, what one contemporary poet bitterly described as government by mattress, forced a change in the Medici's power structure. Piero could no longer serve as both the face and the hand of governance. Into this vacuum stepped his son Lorenzo, who was only 20 years old. The boy who had once been introduced at courtly dinners was now expected to host ambassadors, manage crises, and receive petitioners. Though officially still second in command, Lorenzo was increasingly viewed by foreign and domestic observers alike as the true executor of policy. Lorenzo's emergence marked a tonal shift in Florentine politics. He was charismatic where Piero was rigid, gregarious where his father was suspicious. He could flatter nobles, soothe merchants, and deliver stirring orations without notes. For many in Florence, he embodied a welcome return to civility and grace. But his rise was not without danger. Several of Piero's advisors, particularly Jacopo de Poggio and Bernardo Buongirolami, worried that Lorenzo's popularity might invite disobedience, even rebellion. They urged Piero to reassert himself publicly, to demonstrate strength even in illness. The result was one of the most bizarre spectacles in Medici history. In April 1469, during a public religious procession, Piero insisted on being seen. Unable to walk, he was dressed in full formal attire, velvet robes lined with ermine and lifted onto a wooden dais mounted on a four-wheeled platform. His face was painted with white powder to cover signs of illness, and rosewater was poured over his linens to suppress the odor of his infected joints. The contraption was pulled through the streets by servants, while guards flanked it to block the curious from drawing too near. Contemporary diarists described the scene as majestic in pretense, tragic in substance. One account notes that a child fainted after catching sight of Piero's exposed hand, the skin blackened and split at the knuckles. After this episode, Piero never again attempted a major public appearance. He retreated into the Palagio permanently, and his governance became more surreal. Visitors described late-night audiences where he spoke from behind curtains or communicated via intermediaries, asking questions and issuing judgments without ever showing his face. Rumors multiplied that his toes had been amputated, that his mind was deteriorating, that he had turned to alchemy to find a cure for his condition. At least one apothecary was executed in secret, accused of having supplied blasphemous compounds that were believed to damage the soul as well as the body. Meanwhile, the business of the city pressed on. The Medici Bank was still functional, but had begun to show signs of strain. Branches in Bruges and London reported shrinking margins, and several partners expressed concern about the Florentine headquarters' increasingly unpredictable demands for liquidity. Piero, obsessively monitoring the ledgers, ordered the recall of multiple loans, including several to prominent Florentine families. This move, while financially justifiable, reignited fears that the Medici were using their banking apparatus for political control. More than one merchant quietly moved assets to rival institutions, anticipating a financial collapse if Piero were to die suddenly. The city's political institutions continued to erode. The Signoria had become a rubber stamp, its officials carefully screened through Piero's influence. Even ceremonial offices such as the Gonfalonier of Justice were increasingly filled by pliant figures with no real autonomy. One disturbing trend became clear: civic offices were being rotated among a small set of loyalist families, effectively shutting out a broad swath of the Florentine elite. The Republic still existed on paper, but in practice, Florence was being governed as a hereditary principality. In private, Piero struggled with the psychological toll of his condition. Multiple reports suggest he experienced episodes of night terrors, screaming about phantom conspirators, or shouting his father's name in the darkness. He reportedly ordered a portrait of Cosimo to be removed from his chamber after claiming it glared with accusation. One attendant who later fled Florence described how Piero would sometimes whisper to his own legs, begging them to forgive him for years of pain. Whether these were hallucinations, symbolic expressions of guilt, or signs of mental deterioration, they confirmed what many suspected, that the man at the center of Florentine power was unraveling. By the summer of 1469, Piero's household had become a place of whispered instructions and muffled footsteps. His attendants rotated in shifts trained to respond silently to his groans or gestures. Physicians maintained a log of symptoms, treatments, and failed remedies. One entry notes that his left leg had developed an ulcer that would not close weeping fluid despite constant dressing. Another mentions a fever so intense that his bedclothes had to be changed 3 times in a single night. Piero's daily reality was one of regulated agony, and yet his mind, fragmented though it may have been, still retained the routines of governance. Lorenzo, meanwhile, was preparing for a different kind of leadership. Recognizing that his father might not survive the year, he began forming a corps of younger advisors, including Agnolo della Stufa and Giovanni Tornabuoni, with ties to both the financial and political sectors of the city. He also began reaching out to external powers, most notably Francesco Sforza's heirs in Milan and the court of Naples, to assure them of continuity after Piero's death. These preparations were not openly declared, but they were understood. Florence, it seemed, was bracing for a transition. The only question was whether Piero would go quietly, or whether his grip on power would hold until the very end. By October, his condition had worsened to the point that his speech was often slurred, and his eyes could not focus clearly. He issued fewer directives, and those he did produce were filtered through Lorenzo or scribes who shaped them into more coherent policy. The city held its breath. Piero's death was not a matter of speculation, but of schedule. And yet, even in decline, he remained the central node of a vast political network, one increasingly fragile and one whose unraveling would leave lasting consequences for the republic he had once ruled in the name of order. Florence had long prided itself on being a city of laws, a beacon of republican balance in a peninsula increasingly dominated by princely dynasties. Yet by late 1469, the image of the city as a bastion of civic virtue was wearing thin. Under Piero de Medici, power had retreated from the chambers of public deliberation into the antechambers of a private residence, and from there into a bedroom where government files were sorted alongside poultices and urine flasks. What remained of republican governance was a husk decorative hollow, and subservient to the quiet authority of a man in decay. It was during this phase that Florence underwent one of its most subtle yet profound shifts. No laws were abolished, no constitutions rewritten. Instead, a gradual corrosion took hold, driven by legal ambiguities and administrative expediency. Piero, acutely aware of how fragile his physical presence had become, sought permanence not through legacy, but through structural control. The offices of the Republic were to function like limbs, not minds-obedient extensions of a central will. To this end, Piero reshaped the judicial and bureaucratic foundations of Florence. He manipulated the selection process for the Signoria by packing the electoral purses with names vetted by his inner circle. Through agents embedded in the accoppiatori, the committee responsible for nominating eligible citizens, he ensured that ballots never strayed beyond acceptable boundaries. The result was a string of civic appointments that projected the illusion of legal order while ensuring total loyalty. More alarming were the changes in how justice was administered. Traditional Republican legal procedures emphasized due process and the right of public defense. But by 1468, Piero's government had introduced a parallel system of secret inquests, nominally justified as national security measures against sedition. Citizens could be summoned without notice, held without formal charge, and questioned by special magistrates whose proceedings were never recorded in public logs. These inchieste coperte covert inquests bypassed Florence's long-standing traditions of legal transparency and replaced them with a culture of surveillance. One case that illustrates this shift involved Tommaso Ridolfi, a respected cloth merchant and member of the Wool Guild. In late 1468, Ridolfi was summoned to the Palazzo della Signoria ostensibly to provide testimony in a commercial dispute. He never returned home. Months later, his family received a note unsigned stating that he had been relocated for the safety of the Republic. In truth, Ridolfi had been accused on the basis of an intercepted letter of praising Milanese trade practices over Florentine ones. This trivial remark, interpreted as subversion, resulted in his indefinite exile to a remote village in the Casentino Mountains, where he lived under surveillance until his death 5 years later. No formal verdict was ever issued. Such incidents were not isolated. Piero's administration increasingly relied on preemptive exile as a tool of social engineering. The practice served two functions. It eliminated dissent before it could solidify, and it sent a message to others who might be tempted to voice independent opinions. Between 1467 and 1469, the number of internal exiles rose by over 300%, compared to the previous decade, a figure derived from scattered municipal records and letters sent by displaced citizens. These individuals were neither revolutionaries nor conspirators. They were more often than not inconvenient. And yet, even amid these suppressions, life in Florence continued. Markets bustled, cathedrals held feast days, and artists produced masterpieces, but this surface normality masked a city under quiet psychological duress. Artisans joked and code merchants lowered their voices when naming clients, and scholars inserted double meanings into their writings. One humanist described the period as a time when truth took on masks and masks became permanent faces. Perhaps the most psychologically disturbing episode of this era concerned the convent of Santa Maria degli Angeli. In early 1469, a nun there reportedly experienced visions of a black prince with iron hands who would rule Florence in the name of pain. The visions, written down by a confessor, were dismissed by church authorities, but not before they circulated among the lay population. Some interpreted the Black Prince as a veiled reference to Piero, whose hands were often covered in dark gloves to conceal inflammation and lesions. Others feared it as a prophecy of Lorenzo suggesting he would inherit not just power, but the cruelty that came with it. Piero, upon learning of the incident, ordered the convent's leadership investigated. No action was taken against the visionary nun. Officially, she had fallen into illness and was transferred to a cloistered cell, but the confessor was reassigned to a distant abbey. His written records of the vision were confiscated and destroyed. Unbeknownst to Piero, however, a partial copy survived hidden in the private collection of a minor canon and rediscovered centuries later. Its language is fevered but unmistakably political. He shall not walk, but shall be carried. He shall not speak, but his words shall bite. That Florence could interpret such visions as political commentary reveals how deeply embedded the Medici had become in the city's collective psyche. Piero was not simply a ruler, he had become a symbol, an affliction, a permanent wound. His physical illness mirrored the political sickness of the Republic, chronic, concealed, and consuming. And yet he remained in power. His mechanisms, banking, influence, civic control, intimidation, functioned with precision. Even his enemies conceded that he had not lost his mind, only his body. This distinction was crucial. A madman could be overthrown, but a lucid tyrant, especially one who knew how to manipulate the structures of legality, proved far harder to remove. The irony was bitter. Florence, once a city that had exiled the Medici for overreach, now tolerated a regime in which documents could imprison a man more efficiently than swords. And all the while, Piero's scribes, bankers, and retainers preserved a semblance of normalcy, ensuring that public festivals continued, guild charters were updated, and tax registers stayed current. Still, the system showed signs of fatigue. The Medici Bank, burdened by excessive centralization and uneven management, was beginning to hemorrhage influence abroad. Some foreign branches failed to meet targets. Others reported losses due to delayed decisions. Piero, unwilling to delegate financial authority, remained the bottleneck. His obsession with detail, once an asset, had become a liability. And within Florence, a silent question began to circulate among the elite: how much longer could this continue? By the final months of 1469, Florence was suspended in a grim equilibrium. one that revolved paradoxically around the waning life of a man unable to walk, bathe unaided, or even feed himself without assistance. Piero de Medici, though absent from public sight and increasingly diminished in form, remained the epicenter of power. Every civic appointment, financial directive, or foreign correspondence bore his seal, though in truth many were dictated or entirely authored by others. The machinery of Florentine governance functioned more like a ceremonial procession circling around a throne that had been moved to a sickbed. Inside the Palagio, daily life took on a somber and clinical rhythm. Piero's bedchamber was now more infirmary than office, a place of whispers, footstools, and strategically placed curtains to screen him from visiting eyes. Attendants rotated in shifts. The most trusted were trained to recognize signs of infection or fever before the physician arrived. Medical instruments, bronze probes, suction cups, bone-handled scalpels sat beside inkwells and ledgers. A hired apothecary stayed nearby at all hours, blending narcotic concoctions of opium henbane and camphor to soothe Piero's pain and allow him brief windows of lucidity. These windows were shrinking. His physicians recorded increasingly erratic behavior, outbursts of shouting disjointed instructions, and on one occasion an extended monologue directed at a tapestry of Saint Jerome, whom Piero accused of mocking his condition. Despite these lapses, he remained functionally coherent, just enough for his commands to be obeyed, his authority upheld, and his enemies to remain cautious. Still within the Medici household, preparations had already begun for succession. Lorenzo was consulting advisors in confidence. Key allies were being approached with offers of future positions. The court was entering its final transition, but the patient at its center refused to yield. Piero's decline brought with it a distinct change in the atmosphere of Florence, subtle but unmistakable. There were fewer banquets hosted at the Palagio. The flow of public commissions slowed. Once reliable civic figures appeared less frequently in public, fearing that too much visibility could bring unwelcome attention. One merchant noted in a letter to a colleague in Bologna, "Here power is like damp wool, it weighs upon us and gives off the smell of sickness." Outside the palace, the streets of Florence remained superficially vibrant. Artisans plied their trades, students gathered at the Studio Fiorentino, and processions for saints' feast days marched in orderly lines. But something had changed. A kind of psychological fatigue had gripped the city. Florentines were tired of silence, tired of watching the same men rotate through power under new titles, tired of pretending that their republic was still one. And yet no one moved against Piero. His authority, like the gout that had consumed his body, had become chronic, painful but survivable. Few wished to risk replacing it with something worse. As winter approached, Piero's health entered a final, unmistakable stage of collapse. His lower limbs were ulcerated to the bone. He suffered chills that required his room to be kept perpetually warm, even as the smell of rot became harder to mask. Visitors were forbidden from approaching within arm's length. He no longer wrote at all. His orders were issued through Lorenzo or dictated to a single trusted scribe, Andrea dell'Agnolo, who reportedly wept after transcribing one particularly rambling missive in which Piero demanded the arrest of a man who had died 3 months earlier. But Piero's mind was not wholly gone. In moments of painful clarity, he asked for ledgers, records of land holdings, and updates from his bank agents. He requested reports on the movement of Florentine exiles, and instructed Lorenzo to send envoys to Milan and Rome, seeking quiet assurances of support in the event of his death. Even as his body failed, he tried to manage the transition not for a republic, but for a dynasty. The Medici household began making discreet funeral arrangements. Orders were given to the convent of San Lorenzo to prepare a crypt. Linen sheets and fragrant resins were stockpiled. A prominent sculptor, Andrea del Verrocchio, was summoned to consult on a future funerary monument. Meanwhile, Lorenzo spent increasing time away from the Palagio, consulting privately with the city's military commanders and prominent merchant families, ensuring their loyalty not to Piero, but to what came next. It was during this final decline that the most grotesque and disturbing detail of Piero's last months came to light. One of his attendants, a young apothecary named Benedetto, later wrote in a private letter that Piero had begun to experience what he called reverse dreaming. He would lie awake for hours, eyes open, speaking as though trapped in a dream, describing scenes of fire-bleeding statues and rooms filling with black water. Most unsettling was his recurring fixation on the corpse of his father Cosimo. Piero claimed Cosimo stood at the foot of his bed, mouth sealed shut, pointing toward the bank ledgers with a finger eaten away by worms. While such hallucinations could be explained by pain fever and the cumulative effects of narcotics, they struck a chord with those around him. Cosimo had ruled Florence with a balance of subtlety and restraint. Piero had centralized power, dismantled civic autonomy, and left the Republic hollowed. Whether consciously or not, Piero seemed haunted by the comparison. In early December, his condition worsened further. He ceased to speak altogether for long stretches. His skin became ashen. He stopped eating. On the morning of December 2nd, 1469, surrounded by Lucrezia Lorenzo and a handful of physicians and scribes, Piero de Medici died. The official cause was listed simply as complications from gout. But those close to him knew the truth. He had been dying for years, slowly, methodically, painfully, and with him something in Florence had also perished. The reaction across Florence was muted, even confused. There was no public outpouring of grief, no uprising of resistance. The city, conditioned by years of quiet repression, responded with weary continuity. Funeral processions were held. Officials changed their seals. Lorenzo was formally introduced as head of the Medici household, but no one truly doubted that the power had already shifted to him weeks earlier. The room in which Piero died was sealed for cleaning. His linens were burned. His bed frame, soaked with years of sweat, blood, and unguents, was dismantled and disposed of discreetly. Few relics remained. Only his ledgers, meticulously maintained until the final week, survived intact. They were passed to Lorenzo along with the keys to the vaults and the list of allies, clients, and enemies. Piero the Gouty had never wanted to be a ruler. He had inherited power not by choice but by blood, and governed not with strength, but through mechanisms of control, caution, and fear. His fall was not a dramatic collapse, but a long, festering decline marked by pain isolation and an increasingly desperate grip on a city that had in many ways already moved on. Florence now stood at the threshold of a new chapter, but the shadows cast by Piero's reign would linger long after the curtains were drawn on his sick room. Piero de Medici's death on December 2nd, 1469, marked the end of an era defined less by grandeur than by endurance. His son Lorenzo, just 20 years old, ascended not amid resistance, but in a carefully orchestrated silence. It was a smooth succession, too smooth according to some. Within hours of Piero's death, Lorenzo had already received congratulations from the Signoria, had consulted with key figures in the Medici financial apparatus, and had begun drafting letters to allies in Milan, Venice, and the papacy. He wasted no time. Florence barely paused to mourn. There were funeral rites, certainly somber processions, candlelit vigils, and a high mass held at San Lorenzo, but they lacked the grandeur of Cosimo's burial 5 years earlier. In Piero's case, there was less to commemorate. His rule had not been marked by conquests or public works. It had been shaped by evasion, preservation, and an obsession with control. He had defended the Medici position, but not enriched it. His legacy was continuity, but at a steep emotional and institutional cost. Lorenzo moved quickly to cleanse the political atmosphere. He visited prominent Florentine families, both allies and those whose loyalty had grown cold, and pledged a return to balance. The culture of surveillance was not abolished outright, but its edge was softened. Trials became less secretive, exiles fewer. He personally oversaw the release of several detainees from informal confinement, including merchants, guildsmen, and a minor poet, who had been imprisoned for a veiled critique of the Medici in a festival performance. This was not leniency for its own sake, it was strategy. Lorenzo needed to distinguish himself from his father, and the easiest way to do so was to reintroduce civility. Still, the apparatus of control Piero had built did not vanish. The electoral processes remained shaped by Medici influence. The bank remained central to governance. In the private records Piero had compiled, the infamous ledgers, intelligence notes, and exile lists were kept under lock and key. Lorenzo reviewed them, made annotations, and in some cases destroyed entries. But the archive remained a testament to the methods Piero had employed to stay alive and in power. As Florence moved forward, the image of Piero the Gouty began to ossify into something strangely dual. Officially, he was remembered as a cautious steward who safeguarded Florence through turbulent years. In reality, His rule was more often recalled in private anecdotes, quietly spoken stories of arbitrary exile, paranoid decrees, and that unforgettable image of a man borne through the streets on a velvet-lined platform painted to appear alive. In these retellings, Piero became not merely a historical figure, but a symbol of stagnation, the embodiment of a city caught between its ideals and its survival instincts. One of the most haunting physical testaments to Piero's reign was the transformation of the Medici residence. Under his father Cosimo, it had been a vibrant space of patronage and discussion. Under Piero, it had become a fortified refuge, a place where architecture mirrored illness rooms sealed for secrecy, passages narrowed to monitor movement windows shuttered against intrusion. The layout of the Palagio had in some ways become an extension of his body, confined, inflamed, untrusting. Even Piero's body after death did not escape the scrutiny of the curious. His burial at San Lorenzo was discreet, but in the years that followed, whispers circulated among Medici retainers about the condition of the corpse. It was said that his legs had required wrapping in treated cloth to contain visible decay, and that a faint chemical odor persisted during the entire ceremony. These claims were never officially recorded, but passed down in the margins of personal diaries and letters. The details may have been exaggerated, but they reveal how Piero's identity, public and private, had fused entirely with his affliction. There were also darker revelations. Shortly after his death, it emerged that several city contracts had been manipulated to favor Medici loyalists using clauses that had bypassed traditional oversight. An internal inquiry suggested that these provisions had been implemented not by malice but by the inertia of a centralized system run from a sick room. But the implication was clear: Piero's rule had blurred the line between order and paralysis. Florence had not been governed by ambition or ideology, but by a bureaucratic reflex, an unfeeling mechanism guided by the intermittent lucidity of a man in chronic agony. And yet, for all his flaws, Piero had achieved something few thought possible. He had held the city together. He had prevented civil war. He had ensured that the Medici dynasty survived one of its most vulnerable transitions. In doing so, he may have laid the foundations for his son's much more luminous reign. Lorenzo would go on to be called Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, celebrated for his patronage, diplomacy, and political genius. But that legacy was built on a base Piero had maintained through sheer willpower and administrative vigilance. The price, however, was steep. The republic Piero inherited had been flawed but functional. The republic he left behind had become an empty performance, its institutions reduced to tools of dynastic convenience. And in that transformation lay the deeper tragedy, not simply of a man ravaged by illness, but of a political culture that had accepted decay in exchange for stability. The life and rule of Piero de Medici, known to posterity as Il Gottoso, or the Gouty, offer a stark meditation on the cost of preservation. His was not a reign of glory or conquest, but of maintenance, fortification, and decline. And yet within the slow unraveling of his body and the tightening grip of his authority, Piero altered the trajectory of Florence in ways that reverberated far beyond his own generation. Historians often regard his rule as transitional, a dull interlude between the grand tactician Cosimo and the illustrious Lorenzo. But this simplification misses the deeper reality. Piero governed during one of Florence's most precarious moments, when republican ideals still flickered, yet were increasingly unsuited to the challenges of realpolitik. In navigating conspiracies, factional rivalries, and physical torment, he did not lift the city higher. He held it back from collapse. His tools were not charisma or vision, but process vigilance and fear. In this, Piero was a deeply modern figure. His governance anticipated the bureaucratic absolutism that would come to define early modern states, a regime held together not by inspiration, but by record surveillance and the quiet coercion of administrative precision. He built a government that could function without presence, sustain without popularity, and silence without spectacle. In doing so, he stripped away the romanticism of Florentine republicanism and revealed the skeletal frame beneath a system vulnerable to concentration, especially when cloaked in necessity. His affliction, gout, was not merely a physical condition, but a metaphor. Just as the disease inflamed and immobilized his joints, his reign inflamed anxieties and immobilized civic participation. His body mirrored the state, constrained, discolored, and locked in a slow process of erosion. And yet from this foundation, Lorenzo the Magnificent emerged. Florence would enjoy a cultural and diplomatic renaissance under his guidance, reaping the rewards of a stability Piero had brutally maintained. That legacy, paradoxical as it was, renders Piero not a failed ruler but a necessary one. The price was high, the pain was real, but the dynasty endured.